Coach, we're up to the 70s and got into the 70s last week, and we were talking about the decades of the 70s and 80s, that probably the two most dominating decades in South Carolina football history, with one school dominating in those 2 decades. And we're up to 1973, just a couple of years away from those runs of state championship. Could you already see the writing on the wall at this time, as they say?
Well, not completely. You knew that you had, we were in that stage where we had 65 to 70 guys out for football and plus a B team, and you knew that you were going to lose so many, but there's always some people ready to take over. And I think that's what gives you that real good years, is when you've got those group of people that's repeating, that played a great deal as 10th graders or what have you, and they're going to be around for a couple of years. And with adequate backups, if you don't have good backups, then that's not the case, because one injury can kill you. But we were at a point to where we had enough of good people that the second and third string people were competent and could have filled in and become number one starters real easy. And I think that's the thing that you were realizing was taking place. And but I guess to some degree you could see that it was beginning to work up. Yes.
One thing I have thought about these teams, Coach, and you made me think of it there when you mentioned the numbers of people on the team. I think one of the unusual things about Woodruff is the teams you had, great teams with that many number of people on the teams. Everybody had a way to participate. They were on a specialty team or something, and they got to play. And that wasn't true of a lot of other teams. They didn't play everybody with nothing near the records you had. So that was a strength, don't you think?
Yes, definitely. We tried to say that we wanted to be able to have 3 offensive guards that were going to be considered first string, 3 offensive tackles, 2 centers, 3 or 4 running backs, and then 3 ends, and the same thing on defense. So as a result, youngsters felt very important to be that third person that was going to be called in a first string capacity. Then using people on specialty teams. So what was happening, and if we were dressing 44 or 55 people, 40 of them was getting to play 44, or getting to play an awful lot, and was contributing to your success and getting that experience that when they were called on, they're able to do it. I think as we're approaching, so we'll make comments on this a little bit later on in the 70s, but we had a quarterback situation where we lost a quarterback, and everybody thought, oh gosh, what are they going to do? And as it is, we wound up, and the second guy took over, and we continued to win, and then he got hurt, and the other guy came back and took over. So it's when you've got that type of thing going with numbers, and that's why numbers are important. That's how the big schools like Spartanburg and some of those that get 95 to 100 kids out, all good physical specimens, that they can be consistent year in and year out. They're going to lose a lot of seniors, but they also got a lot of juniors coming back, a lot of sophomores. I think the strength of your team, to many degree, is how many juniors you got coming back. If you don't have a lot of juniors coming back, you can feel like you're not going to be too good. Rising seniors, in other words.
Well, I see that the average point spread in this 1973 team between the Woodruff team and the opposing team was still a wide spread. They didn't get but 9 points a game. You want to go over the scores on that?
Yeah, this was, we give up more points this year than we had in some other seasons, but yet the offense still maintained pretty good. Clinton had an unusually good team that year and beat us 33-2. That was an unusual, a really sound defeat. But we came back and beat Belton Honey Pass 7-6 in a real tough game. Beat Hillcrest 14-0. Lost to Burns, and Burns scored 2 touchdowns on us, which was a little unusual for either team to score 2 touchdowns. But as I said, we weren't as tough defensively as in the past. Liberty beat Liberty 39-0. Beat Cowpens 41-0. Beat Westminster 44-0. Beat Wren 32-6. Beat Pendleton 12-0. Beat Blue Ridge 40-0. Beat Abbeville 28-15 in the playoffs, and then lost to Chapin 34-12. A pretty sound beating by Chapin in the playoffs. Finished the season with a 9-3 record, which still is close to being that 10 games and very respectable. I think any coach would be thrilled to death if during his career he can average 9 wins per season. And we've been able to do that for 43 years. So I think this is what you would consider what you'd like to be an average. You'd like to be able to say we're going to win 9 or 10 games every year. And if we get in the playoffs, we can go a little bit more. But I think it was not a disastrous year by no means. I thought the kids played extremely well to have been down like they were at the beginning with, and just keep coming on and improving.
But you notice one thing too, though, Coach, on the even though you averaged giving up 9 points a game, there was still 6 shutouts in there.
Yeah.
And a lot of those points came to some very, very good teams, obviously.
Well, you look at the fact that Clinton scored 33, was a 3A ball club. Belton Honey Pass scored 1 as a 3A ball club. Burns scored 2, and at that time they were a 4A ball club. And of course, Abbeville was a playoff team that scored 15, and Chapin played for the state championship that year, so they scored 34. That was kind of a low note for us to giving up 34
Right.
points, but it happened, and we just didn't play very well.
Tell us some of the players that was on that team, Coach, and some of their statistics and what have you.
This was another one of those years where we didn't have a dominating back. We had a lot of backs that played pretty doggone well. Roger Beatty was our leading ground gainer with 713 yards and scored 42 points and averaged 4.4. See, we were kind of a cloud of dust team this year. We didn't average highly. Darrell Lancaster had 419 points, and Bobby Saddlefield, our starting quarterback, had 415, and David Foster had 349, and Odell Johnson had 338. Melvin Cook had 251. David Rhodes had 50. Roger Fortenberry had 46. Ron Caldwell 25, and then some of the others that didn't get to play much rounded it out. Had 2,500 yards, almost 2,600, 2,599 yards rushing. We only averaged 4.4 per carry, which means that lots of times we were not getting first downs, and I think that'll be reflected when we talk about punting. We weren't a real good passing team. We only completed 27 out of 86 passes, which was only 31%, and you got to be an effective passing team, you've got to have a little bit better percentage than that. That's not even one completion every 3 times, and you can't make a living unless you can do a little bit better than job than that. We just didn't do a great job passing. We relied on the run, but we did think they had a good balance. When you look at that many backs all contributed, and all of them was contributions as far as the team concerned. I guess those 2, Roger Beatty and Darrell Lancaster, was really our workhorse. They had more carries than the rest of them, but the rest of them did right well as far as the yardage they contributed. In the passing situation, we had a 377 yards, which isn't much for a team, the passing route, but coupled with the rushing, it still gives us a pretty good offensive thrust.
Right. And he's got some points on punt returns that year? Or
yes, we had a good year with punt returns. We scored 24 points on punt returns. Odell Johnson had 3 touchdowns returned, 3 punts returned for touchdowns, and David Foster had 1. So this is pretty good to be able to pick up 24 points on punt returns. Actually, our passing game was rather productive in it, the fact that we had 48 points, which is a good number of touchdowns out of completions that we were able to score that many touchdowns, but they were not the long variety passes. They were play action passes, and still one of the most reliables that we've been thrown down through the years is the dump pass to the tight end and also the end across. So those are the basic 2 patterns that we were able to throw, and we just didn't have the arm or the strength to do anything much better than that as far as the passing game is concerned.
But when you get 27 receptions, 48 points out of 27 receptions, I mean, most of them were touchdown passes, or a good percentage of them were anyway.
Percentage-wise, yes.
Yeah. Probably dump passes near the goal line, I would imagine.
A lot of times they were, yeah.
So, but the big thing that year was the running game. And I see the punter had an excellent, well, at least one punter had a 35.6 average there, and the other one over 30, so, and not much on the return.
That's true. We still did a good job covering.
Yes.
We averaged only 1.27 on returns, and that's still extremely good, even though we weren't punting the ball deep. I think the deeper you kick the ball, the more yards you're going to have return, because sometimes you out kick your coverage. But we had a little bit of trouble trying to get somebody that could be consistent at kickoff returns, and we used an awful lot of people there. Trying to find out somebody that could be real consistent. It looks kind of funny when you look down the line on kickoff returns. Roger Beatty had 8 attempts and averaged 16 yards, and David Foster had 6 attempts and averaged 16. Odell had 3 attempts and averaged 18. Vernon Browning, old Squeaky, was beginning to make his appearance.
Yeah.
And he had one return for 17 yards, and David Rhodes had 2 returns for 17, and Darrell Langster had 1. So we tried a lot of people, and Rodney Billings had 1, Melvin Cudd had 1. So we tried a lot of people there trying to find somebody to give us that good opening kickoff that we needed, or whenever other teams, we give up, they had to kick to us when they scored. We wanted to get in good field position. Punting didn't do bad, like you said, 32 yards by one punter, 32.7, the other 35.6. Kickoffs, we didn't do a great job on kickoffs. We didn't average kicking the ball too terribly deep. Had several people trying to do the job kickoffs, but we didn't. Just like I said, when you only average kicking 44.6 on the kickoff and they're returning 16 yards, that puts them in pretty good field position. We had very few people that could kick it in the end zone. Let's see, that's 60 yards, takes this 60-yard kick to get it in the end zone, and we're averaging we're averaging 16 yards to the 16-yard line, and then they're returning 16, so that means they've gotten out to the 32-yard line, which is in fair field position.
Right. So this team made it to the second round of the playoffs, and a pretty good pass defense that year, Coach?
Yeah, I think one of our strong points down through the years has been pass interceptions, and we did intercept 11 passes. I think the years that we've not been good on defense, we did intercept a lot of passes. The same token, when we give up a lot of yardage, you don't intercept many passes, because the passes are not as many thrown, and people are, they go up top on you if they're able to run the ball. But still didn't do bad with 11 pass interceptions. Nobody real outstanding. Odell Johnson led the list with 3, Carol Phillips 2, David Foster 2, and Darrell Langster 2. Began to do a pretty good job on kickoff, on PATs. Carol Phillips was a PAT guy, and he made 19 out of 27 for 70%. This is better than a few years, but we like to hover around 85%, but he was up. We'd been 60 and 61, 62 for a long time, but he did a good job in the way of PATs.
That might have been a transition type thing, because I know later on we're going to see some kickers with extremely high percentages on PATs and field goals and so forth.
Let's look at comparisons just a little bit as far as the opposition that particular year. We gained 2,599 yards rushing. The opposition gained 1,252, so we doubled what our opposition got. They turned around and almost doubled the passing. We passed for 377 yards, and they passed for 610. But the difference is still over 1,000 yards in rushing. Total offense, we averaged 29.7. We had 29.76, and the opponents averaged 18.62. Run more plays. We averaged 4.5. They averaged 3.5. So the things, they attempted 128 passes and completed 43, and we intercepted 11 of them. But now the thing's a little bit bad. We had 9 pass interceptions and only attempted 86 passes, and only completed 27. So there wasn't quite enough of a difference between the ones we intercepted and what the other people intercepted off of us. You'd like to get that thing down where at least a 2-to-1 ratio, preferably a 3-to-1 ratio or better. But see, this wasn't a 2-to-1 ratio, and that affected us an awful lot. Let me mention the coaching staff that we had. I got that in here, which is most unusual, and I think it was a good coaching staff. I think we got along extremely good, and they were loyal people, and the more I've coached, the more I've found out that that's something that is important to you, and I feel like that this was a good group, and if we mention the names, I think you'll know what I'm talking about. Larry Minish. Old Larry was with us as backfield coach and in charge of the B team, and there's never been a better defensive backfield coach than Larry Minish, and I don't think many basketball coaches any better than Larry Minish. Old Shell Dooley, who's going to Greenwood, was our defensive line coach and did one heck of a job, and Shell is a class act, and there again, one of the 3 best offensive coaches or defensive coaches we've ever had. And he's proven his worth because he continues to do well at all levels that he's been at. And I predict that before he's ready to retire, you're going to see Greenwood back on the map as far as being a power in 4A schools. Dennis Lynn was our offensive line coach, and Dennis was a fine gentleman. He's a minister now. He went into full-time ministry work and still pastor at Travelers Rest Baptist Church. And and just was a great bunch of guys. And of course, Gordon Godfrey came with us. He is at the junior high, and Jim Rich was at the junior high, and Gordon is still with us. And they started out with the junior high, and he's now with the varsity. And Jim Rich left us and went to Whitmire, and then from Whitmire to Dixie, and now he's head coach at Dixie. And Jim did a good job. So it had a real good coaching staff, and just great guys to work with. And as I said, loyalty was one of their trademarks, and loyalty to not only to me but to the school in general. And sometimes that's something that we lose sight of in today's world, that people don't know what the word loyal means.
That's true. Is there anything about this team, Coach, in general that you'd like to talk about specifically before we look at 1974?
It's hard to remember too much. You know, it was one of those teams that didn't advance beyond the second round. We got beat the second round. So, and it was a team that if you look at the stats, one time it'd be one guy, next time it'd be somebody else. So we didn't have that one big gun, and I think that's what we're missing. I think that's why we're at 9-3 and didn't advance anymore. We didn't have the one big gun that could make the big plays for you consistently. I think about the Abbeville game was certainly an exciting game, 28-15 in the playoffs. Had to be a very exciting game for us, and it was an important game for us to win. And of course, then we turned around next week and didn't play very well against Chapin. But like you pointed out, we're able to get some shutouts, give up a few more points than we'd normally given up. But all in all, I think this was a classic example of a team effort. They won 9 games, and it took everybody doing the right thing without the superstar. And I think that's a trademark of this bunch of kids, is that they just didn't have as much talent as some other people maybe had, but they were able to play together as a team and get more out of themselves, and maybe they thought they could get it, as collectively we got more out of the team effort than we did with more talent sometimes. And I think that's always encouraging to me, to have kids that play together well, and that they're not jealous of each other, and that they've got the right kind of feeling and respect for their coaches. And I don't think I ever can remember during this year that we had anybody show any disrespect to any coach on the coaching staff. And there again, you can't say that's the case so many times, but I think this is typical of this bunch of kids. They were just top-notch folks.
Yeah, and I think that's going to carry, that type of person carries over throughout the decade of the 70s and much of the 80s too, because you had some of these type people with that type of character and attitude in the late 70s with a lot more talent. So that was a big plus for them at that particular time. Is there anybody on that team that you want to mention that we haven't mentioned, Coach, before we go on? I know that you've covered just about most of them, going through the various positions and so forth.
Well, there's a big squad. There's a lot of youngsters that we've, that stayed with us in some capacity. Tommy Fortner was on this team, and old Tommy has coached midget leagues forever, and he's still contributing something to the program. There's just a lot of people that contributed, that become pretty good players in the years after this. But it was a big squad, and they just did a heck of a good job at, as I said, playing together and doing what they're supposed to do. Big Audie Timms was on this team. Big Audie was one of the biggest guys we've had since Billy Thaxton. He came along, and Audie was the next biggest guy we'd had at that time. We've had a lot of big fellas since, but up until that time, Big Bill was the biggest, and Jim Caldwell, of course, he was probably the first big one, and then Thaxton, and then Audie. But since then, we've had a multitude of near 300-pounders or even above 300 pounds.
One of the first ones that I can remember, and I don't know if you mentioned him when we played or not, but he was a Shrine Bowler. I think Dewey Godfrey. He was
Big Dewey, that's right.
Excellent lineman. But one of his assets, Coach, since we brought him up, was he was quick and fast with his size, was he not? As well
terribly
as being
strong, and in a pain threshold that's almost inhuman. I mean, he could stand pain as good as anybody that ever lived, and still play and still keep going. I think about Big Dewey. I think about having to open an abscess on his thigh that he had gotten at camp. He fell through the boards at camp playing King of the Raft, not King of the Raft, but King of the Tower, with a bunch of kids from Lockhart and another school that was up there. And the boards broke with him, and he fell through, and it tore his leg up his thigh. he didn't. He kept on playing and practicing, and suddenly I can't stand it. It's hurting me so bad, I can't stand it. So he'd come in, and I looked, and it was inflamed like something crazy. It come to a big head on that thing on his thigh where he'd gotten scratched a little bit. And you know, in those days, I did a lot of foolish things. I just got me a doggone good knife and sterilized that thing, one of those little blades, and I lanced it and opened that book. And it must have, a teacup of corruption must have come out of there. But he didn't miss a beat. He didn't miss practice. He didn't miss what he's supposed to do because he was a tough hombre. That's all there was to it. He was big and tough.
No wonder it was hurting.
Yeah, it was awful. I mean, and it inflamed the temperature in his leg, and he didn't. You know, he just passed
probably
it up
never
for a
took,
long time. He wasn't concerned about it.
Probably never took any antibiotics or anything for infection.
No, didn't take anything.
He's tough.
Just a tough customer, and he's a good football player too.
Well, as we move on, Coach, through the 70s, 74, I always looked upon this year. Of course, I was away a good bit of this time in the military service, but of course I kept up with things. I looked at it as kind of a valley in between the peaks because it was just not quite as good a year as the year before, not quite as good as what was coming.
Yeah, it was one of those years where you did some things a little bit better and other things you didn't do quite as good. If we run down the scores, opened up with Clinton again and lost again to Clinton 13-6. Lost to Belton Honey Path 14-12. We'd beaten the previous year. And then lost to Burns 8-0. And then wound up and lost to Newberry 20-7. So we are 0-4, which has happened to us a couple more times. But we had some people more our size to go up against after that, and were able to beat Liberty 21-0, and beat Cowpens 49-7, beat Westminster 28-0, lost to Wren 14-6, and then beat Pendleton 28-21, beat Blue Ridge 69-0, beat Blacksburg 13-0. And then lost to Chapin in the playoffs, 12-0. That means 12-0. Kind of a jinx they had on us. It still scored 239 points and give up 109, which was not the kind of balance that you'd like to see, but it was not bad considering we had to play with some people that were not quite ready to play, and that we just didn't have we had the beginning of some good folks, and they just a little bit away from us. They weren't quite ready to take over and do the job that they later did. You look at Russian, we there again still didn't have that named guy that could make the great big plays for you. Randall Garland was our leading rusher with 675 yards. Frankie Walker, who was a quarterback, had 280, and Rusty Lambert, who was the other quarterback, had 277. So between the two quarterbacks, we had 600 yards, but nobody else was noticeable. Ron Cowell had 219. Terry Mays was just beginning to emerge. This was Terry's 10th grade year, I believe. He had 213. Turk Watson just appeared on the scenes as a 10th grader. He had 107 yards. Johnny McAfee had 99. Marshall Ferguson had 96. Larry Mays ran a little bit, and later we moved him to the line, had 22 yards. Vernon Browning carried the ball one time that year as a 10th grader. And those guys later become outstanding people, and I think that's what we were getting. As you said earlier, is beginning to lay the foundation for that. Frankie Walker was our quarterback, completed 28 out of 68 passes for 555 yards. Johnny McAfee was backup for him. He completed 14 out of 30. Rusty Lamford was just beginning, and he completed 5 out of 20. So we didn't do badly, a little bit better than we had in the past. 39% completions, completed 47 out of 118, had 8 interceptions, which isn't too terribly bad when you consider the fact that we had to throw the ball a little bit more than usual. I think a thing worth mentioning, we had an unusually good receiver that year that led us, that did a good job for us on pass receiving. Keith Garrett was emerging as one of our better receivers. He had 27 receptions out of 55, scored 78 points. So there again, that old dump pass was going good to us. And Frankie had a great game against Pendleton that he set a record in the most yards called or received as a pass receiver in a game. And he was just and later was chosen to play in the Shrine Bowl when he became a senior. So he didn't choose to go because we were in the playoffs, and he chose to stay with us. But Ronnie Bowen was also a good receiver, and we had some pretty good guys there that were going to emerge a little bit later on and make us a much better ball club.
One thing I noticed about in addition to that, about the scores, coach, the defense, you still had a good many shutouts, and no score in this season had as wide a differences in between the points we scored and the points we gave up. Nobody scored an inordinate amount of points against us that year, and every game was close.
Had a chance to win
yeah.
3 more. That we're at 6-6 is not an acceptable record, but it turns out beats 4 and 6 or whatever the case might be. But in those days, you only had one team going to the playoffs, so we still managed to. We had 2 teams going to the playoffs. We went as the number 2 team that particular year. Later, you only had 4 and a half, 4 teams going to the playoffs.
But still, a respectable defensive, a more than respectable defensive year when you look at the point range of scores there.
Right.
And so this is the year before the start of the run of the 4 state championships. Anything in particular in this year that stands out in your mind about kickoff returns or punt returns or punting, anything outstanding in this particular year?
Well, I really, it's hard to go back and remember exactly everything, but I think one of the things that was a real boost to us, that Randy Pollard did PATs for us, and he made 25 out of 31, which was 80%, which was a big jump up, and put us back in in the area where you've got to have that if you're going to be effective in scoring and taking advantage of those extra points. We intercepted 12 passes, which is still, that's an average of 1 a game, and if you can force that average of 1 turnover a game, you shouldn't be hurting too terribly bad. You look at the team performances. Pretty much we give up too much yards rushing. We had 2,000 yards rushing. The opposition had 1,269. We passed for 745 yards, and the opposition passed for 528. But we still had 1,000 yards difference in total offense. We had 2,750, and they had 1,750 roughly. So that part was pretty much the same. I think IDW defense shows that they only averaged 2.9 yards per play. We averaged 4.5, which is a big to-do, a big difference. We intercepted 12 passes, they intercepted 8, so that turnover ratio was there. And fumbles, recovered. We recovered 30 fumbles, and the opposition recovered 32, so we didn't gain much there. That was pretty even, balanced out. Like to mention the coaching staff there again. Larry Minish was still with us, and Dennis Lynn was still with us, and Shell Dooley was still with us in the same capacity. Gordon Godfrey was in the same capacity. Jimmy Rich, and then we had somebody working with the B team, some not graduate assistants, but some part-time people. Tommy Jennings and Randy Lawrence worked our B team and worked exclusively with our B team that we didn't have the previous year. And I think maybe their work helped play the future for these teams we're talking about, because that's the first time we'd had 2 people that were able to work with the B team exclusively, and they were both former players and did a real good job. Tommy was a good linebacker and had a good eye for defense and a good eye for football, and he's very intelligent, very smart football player, and I think he helped us an awful lot.
Coach, the way you arranged this, and this might have been affected too, Tommy and Randy worked with the B team, and when they had games, did one of the assistant coaches alternate going?
We alternated, and one went with them because you're supposed to have somebody on the sidelines that's a full-fledged staff member. We would never let them go off without having somebody with them, but we did rotate those people around, and they enjoyed it. Minish liked to go. Minish would go more than anybody else because he liked to do that.
So are you saying in this case, Coach, you think that they got a little more individual attention or something as B teams when you had more help?
Yeah,
more
I think they did. They definitely got
that.
more attention, right.
So 74 was, I think the character of this team might be to say this. They're better than, maybe would you say they're better than their record indicates?
Yeah.
Because of the, I was impressed, you look at that 6-6 record, but I was impressed with their defensive abilities. Even though they lost 6 games, they didn't give up any extremely high number of points in one game, and they had several shutouts.
Well, it says about like one of those other games. You give up 109 yards and you play 12 games, so that's less than it's about 9 points.
Right.
About the same thing
Right.
given a couple of those other things. Not like our average for 39 years was 6 points.
Right.
But it's not much above it.
No.
Certainly beats what we did the last 4 years, I'll put it that way.
Yes, sir, that's for sure. And I noticed, too, that 4 of those 6 losses came against those non-conference larger schools that you always play in the preseason. And by this time, it looks they had started rearranging the schedule where all your conference games come after the non-conference
Right.
games. Yeah. So 74 then was a 6-6, and we're ready to move into the first of that 4 state championship run, 1975, and that had to be of course, you didn't know it was going to lead to 4, but still, it's a state championship game, and you had to have some idea about the caliber of teams that would be coming for the next 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, I had a lot of them coming back, and let's just really point out a few things. That 75 team had some tough ball games, and they come from behind and did a great job in the playoffs. But I think the thing that was so indicative of them, they gave up only 87 points in 14 ball games. Nobody scored more than 2 points, 2 touchdowns on them, and some of them were in losing causes, but we managed to score 374. And I think we lost a real great game, and I've always felt like this was a great game. We lost to Clinton 3-0. They kicked a field goal late in the game, and we had intercepted a pass, and no, they intercepted a pass. We were going for a Hail Mary. And there's just a few seconds left in the ball game, and we throw a Hail Mary pass. They intercept it, but the idea was, we have to go into overtime, but we wanted a chance to win. We still had 50-something seconds left on the clock, and I felt like we threw a deep pass that if we got it intercepted, we'd have a chance to tackle them. But we throw the deep pass, they intercept it, they run it back, and then we get a 15-yard out of bounds hitting the guy on the sideline, and that tacked it on. They lined up to kick the field goal and beat us. And it was a great game, and I just think that in this always, I've thought about this, the previous year to this, Clinton had lost a state championship game by a missed field goal by the same guy. And here he is coming back the first game his senior year. He kicks a field goal that wins a very crucial ball game for them, a very important ball game for them. So I'd like to think about that as the poetic justice, if you please, for a young man who had been certainly dejected like I'll get it when he misses the extra point that had won the state the field goal that had won the state championship for him. But then to come back and beat us, and prior to a lot of people thinking, Clinton game was as important the Woodruff game was as important to Clinton as it was to us, and vice versa, because they used it as a measuring stick too. They felt like if they won that game or if they played tough, they were going to be tough. And so many times we had a contract where we would play, if neither team was in the playoffs, then we'd come back in the 11th game, play them. Never got to play, because during that period of time, most of the time both of us were in the playoffs, and if we weren't, they were, and if they weren't, we were. So we never got a chance to play the second game, but it's kind of a backup to help the finances in case you did have both of us had a bad year. Belton Honey Path 14-0. Burns 17-13. Back to a good defensive game as a real struggle. Newberry was one of the strong teams in the 3A category, and they beat us 14-3. Then we got into the conference play. It was 21-0 over Liberty, 56-0 over Cowpens, 48-0 over Westminster, 17-14 over Wren. Wren was emerging as a good football team. We later had to battle them down the line for championships during this 70 run, but we were able to beat them 17-14. Pendleton 27-6, and then dear old Blue Ridge 70-0, and Chesney 38-7. And Chesney had a good team that year. We played extremely good and was able to beat them. Then we started the playoffs and beat Ware Shoals, who was a great team. And I remember Larry Garr was quite a Ware Shoals fan, naturally being close to Lawrence, and he carried their games. And he had predicted them to upset us and beat us, but we were able to beat them 21-0. And then we go to Fort Mill in the playoffs, or Fort Mill came here, I believe it was Fort Mill was with us. 21-16 was a good ball game, and there's a very good team. And then we played Bamberg Earhart for the state championship, 21-14. There's some things when we get back to talking. We might as well talk about it now. I think this game was certainly a game of where people rose to the occasion. we made some plays that were, that this particular game, Stan Watson made tackles all over the field. If I'm not mistaken, he had something like 26 tackles in this ball game, which is a high for us even this day for one man to make. And he was from sideline to sideline, and he blocked a punt, and he blocked 2 punts, to tell you the truth. So he was just fantastic on defense. And yet we had an incident that I like to tell. Bruce Hayes was a backup end who very seldom played. And Bruce always stood right next to me to hear the play because he was interested in everything that took place, but he got to play very little. And he was on the right side of me, and for some reason the other guy that we sent in plays was normally on the right side. And I turned to Bruce. We were down the goal line in a situation. I turned to Bruce, and I didn't realize it was Bruce. I thought it was the other end who normally carried in plays, and I told him what to run. And he went running on the field, and I says, "Oh my gosh, get him out, get him out." But he went ahead and let him go, and Frankie found him in the end zone and completed the pass to him for a touchdown. That put us ahead. And then the same thing happened again later in the ball game. So he scored 2 touchdowns in that game, and he didn't normally get to play. And I remember the headlines would come out on the Spartanburg paper said, "Seldom use end wins or scores 2 touchdowns for the win against Bamberg Earhart." And they had lost. Bamberg Earhart had played for the state championship for about 3 out of the last 5 years prior to this, but they lost them every one, and so they lost again. The coach was just devastated because they had played for it so many times and not be able to come through. But it was a beginning of some great years, and I don't think the years prior to this was bad.
No.
But we did win 12 and lose 2, and it had good offense and good defense, and back to that old thing, 14 games and you only give up 87 points,
right.
So you're back close to that average, what you'd like to stick with that average.
Well, now, Coach, there's a couple of things that came to mind. At the end that happened to get sent in twice, I guess that's a case of being in the right place at the right time.
That's true. That's true.
But another thing that struck my mind on this too, Coach, 2 things. Number one is a strategy type situation. You know, in those days you didn't play off every tie. You were mentioning the Clinton game early on, that 3-0 game.
Non-conference games didn't have to be played off.
You could, both coaches agreed to it, if I remember correctly. Right. But I was going to say, I don't know what y'all agreed to that night, but if you weren't going to play off a tie, then that would have affected your strategy as to those last few seconds of the game, because you could always rely on the overtime and not take as many chances as you would take in the regulation if you're trying to get yourself in position to win.
Well, we decided that, the Clinton game was always such a pivotal game for both of us. If ends the tie, wanted to stay in the tie. And we didn't ever play it off. That was agreed until the rules said you had to play off all games. Because what was taking place, that game become a buffer game in the point system for folks that if they lost in the tie, it didn't give them the same point structure when they were choosing 4A, 3A teams. And we were still on the point system, didn't figure with us, but it did with 3A. So most of the times, if you're playing 3A, you played them off. But if you're playing intermingled, you didn't play it off. But that particular time we did. I think an interesting point, too, when you think about scoring, this is the first time in a long time with us that our kicker was our leading scorer, which is very unusual. Randy Pollard had 50 points of the field goal route, the PAT route, and he emerged again as a very good kicker, and I got to check his 80% on 98%. This was the year that he hit 50 straight. He had 50 in a row and missed the 51st one. He hit 50 out of 51, which is a record, 98% for conversions, and that was fantastic. On top of that, he kicked 4 out of 5 field goals for 80%,
right.
And he was our leading scorer with 62 points. And Kirk Watson was our next scorer with 60 points, and Keith Garrett had 54, Frankie Walker had 42, Vernon Brown had 36, Bill Johnson had 24, Randy Garland had 18, Rusty Lamford had 18, Terry Mays had 12, Joey Johnson had 12, Mike Peace had 12, and James Walton had 6, and Terry Leake had 6, and Johnny Bevel had 6, and Bruce Hayes had. Bruce did not score but 1 touchdown. The other one was for a first down, not for 2 touchdowns. I'd forgotten.
But he still got his touchdown.
He got his touchdown on the first one, yeah. But see, that's a lot of people scoring, and not any one person dominated. So then some of these names you're going to hear again who will be scoring more and more. But
Right.
that's a lot of people to have scoring for you in a high school season. So it was truly a team state championship too, with not a real great performer that dominated the play, so to speak. When you look at the rushing situations, Kenny was our leading rusher with 833 yards. And I remember, Kenny was real small, and we kept trying to run him wide, and he did a pretty decent job running wide. But one day in practice, we decided to run him on a trap. And I remember one of the coaches said, well, he's too small. He can't get yardage inside. But the first time we ran him on a trap, boom, he popped it through and went for a long touchdown run. And it became more and more in practice that he could run those traps. So what we did then, we decided to try to run traps in the ball game. And most of his yardage came on traps. He was not playing very much regular until we started running traps. And he'd probably run the trap play as good as anybody we ever had. Yet he weighed about 130 pounds, but he had that explosiveness. And he got by folks, had pretty good blocking. But then our Vernon Browning was one of the quarterbacks. He had 694 yards, and then Randall Garland had 314. Rusty was the other quarterback, had 306. Frankie Walker had 292. So we had a lot of people contributing. Again, Terry Mays had 247. So we had a lot of people contributing as far as the rushing game is concerned. And then the passing was kind of divided up. Frankie Walker and Rusty divided up the passing, attacked and playing the rec. One of them had 323 yards passing, the other had 401. So it was truly a team effort again, and I think great teams are always team effort, team-oriented teams. Keith Garrett had a great year as a pass receiver. He caught 23 out of 65, which is, again, a pretty good percentage. Scored 54 points. So you got good performance out of them, and there again, had a lot of people having thrown passes to him. Some 12, 13 guys had passes thrown to him. Punt returns, 4 people returning punts, and still did not return one for a TD, but we did a pretty decent yards on punt returns as far as yardage is concerned. Kickoff returns, still didn't have anybody to score, but there again we had 5 people that took part and made some contribution in that. Punting, Randy also did our punting, and this was, Randy was very valuable to us that year. He punted 56 times and averaged 34.55, which was up about 3 or 4 yards from what we normally did. And the remarkable thing was only two tenths of a yard return, which meant that we were get great coverage out of our folks. Kickoffs, Vernon Browning was our key guy. He was just a 10th grader at that time, but he was a key guy as far as punt returns were concerned, and averaged 15 yards per punt return, which isn't bad, but we didn't score any touchdowns on it. Interceptions, again, we had 18 pass interceptions, which is a good number, and it's back to that old ratio that's a little bit better than, more like what you'd love to have. The opposition had 10. We had 18, so that was a difference in that. And punt recoveries, they still recovered more punts, more fumbles than we did, but it was still pretty good performance. And this was still part of that same coaching staff. I'd like to mention some changes on that, some additions. Larry Minish was still with us as backfield coach, and Dennis Lynn was the offensive line coach. Shell Dooley was defensive line coach. Gordon had moved up to the B team from the junior high, had been to junior high before. Ben Dorman came to the junior high as junior high coach. Lewis Roper was the 7th, 8th grade coach. Ben had the 9th grade, and Tommy Jennings had the B team. So we're beginning to play that 7th, 8th, 9th grade, and then the B team, and I think that's reflected in the next 3 or 4 years, the success we have in the next 3 or 4 years.
Also, you're beginning to expand your coaching staff a little bit, get a few more people in there to help out at this point. But there's one thing, Coach, 2 things I wanted to mention about that. One of the things, first of all, the extra points. Pollard's 50 out of 51. That meant not only the kicker, but the snapper and the holder and everybody else had to be doing his job.
Had to be performing perfect, right.
And so that's something the whole PAT team can take pride with him in. But, as far as the games, I of course wasn't working here at that particular time, but I followed the games closely, and I've listened to the coaches who are still around talk about that season a lot. We've talked with them. I talked with Gordon and several people about that several times. And you mentioned it, alluded to it briefly already. I guess if I had to pick out a game that might have, nudged us up a bit. I don't know if one game can do it or not, but I think maybe it can in some cases. Would be that Bamberg-Earhart state championship game when Stanley Watson blocked 2 points, and I think it came from behind in the fourth quarter to win the ball game. And do you think possibly that game might have set the tone for the next few years to come?
Yeah, it gave them, it had been some time. We'd won a state championship in 1965.
Right.
And here it is 10 years later, and we win another one. And I think this revived the spirit that we had. 65, the spirits were tremendous high. They were still high in 68 when we played for the upper state championship up at Dorman against James Island, but we lost. And so you begin to get a little loss in interest. I mean, the crowds were still good, but there wasn't the same enthusiasm there. But this winning 10 years later, winning that state championship for the second time and winning it at home, you see, that was a big thing too. We won at home. The first 2 times we won, we'd won away from home, and then in 85 and the state championship in 65 was away from home. Sure. This was the first state championship at home, and the cannon was booming loud and clear, and they began to do a lot of things with a lot of people that involved really support. Not trying to tell you how to do things, but support. Right. There's a lot of difference, and I think we had great support, and it did kind of lay the foundation for the next years. And we could have, we played for the state championship the 5th year in a row, and it could have been a real big thing for Woodruff as far as the national scene is concerned, because several television national outfits were coming in here and was going to do stories if we'd have won it, and then we didn't win it, so everybody got ticked off because we got beat, but it still kind of laid the foundation for it.
But that was an interesting and exciting year, 1975, the first state championship, first of 4 and in a row, and 1976 we move on into that one. And I remember, I wasn't working here at these games, but I can remember them because by this time I'm out of the service and teaching in School District 5. And you're going to talk about a Burns game there in just a few minutes. It was one of the most exciting. I was a spectator at that game, and it was one of the most exciting ones I've ever seen. And that whole, I was teaching at Duncan Elementary, and you mentioned this a moment ago, this ties in with it. The fan interest up there, and the fan interest here in that game, and that wasn't the only game like that. Burns wasn't, Clinton and some of the others was the same way. That seemed to have bumped up a little bit too, as with this extra spirit you're talking about.
Absolutely. That game and the Clinton game have always been, one on one side of us, one on the other side of us. But those games have been tremendously important to both squads, no matter what classification they play. This team of 76 may be the best team we've ever had when you stop to think about it. First year state champions, and we're the only undefeated team in the state, all classes. That means 4A, 3A, Big 16, the whole works. Only undefeated team in the state. Unscored on in the playoffs, which had not happened before. Averaging better than 33 points per game in the playoffs. So if it's truly a team that dominated the opposition, this was it. We're undefeated, 13-0, but we had that tie on there, one tie, and that tie was against Burns that you just mentioned. A great game against Clinton, 14-6, and run roughshod over Bolton Honey Path, 33-0, and then really got shut down with a great defensive effort by both ball clubs, 0-0 tie, and yet you felt like you'd come away a winner. Yeah. Both teams felt like they'd come away a winner. Didn't have to play it off, and both teams come away a winner. Beat Chapman 40-7. Not a real tough ball game, of course. Beat Chesney 28-6, and Chesney had a good team, very good team, and they had beaten our junior high, I think, a couple of years prior to that, and they were tough. They were a very good ball game. Right. Westminster 77-7, which was a complete runaway, and we were under quarterback sneak about 50 times in a row, it seemed like, because we couldn't keep from scoring almost every time we run a play. Beat Liberty 62-0, beat Wren 24-0, beat Blue Ridge 61-0, beat Pendleton 35-14. The only team that scored twice on us was Pendleton. Beat Pageland, dear old Pageland. Yeah. This was good, beat Pageland 41-0. So that was a good win for us. Beat McCormick 36-0, beat Abbeville 30-0, beat Lakeview 31-0 down at Dillon, I believe. No,
I don't know where that was played.
It was played in another site, but it was played in Lakeview. I want to think Dillon. It was Dillon. That's where it was. a great team scoring 512 points and only giving up 14 and 13-0 in one tie, and the only undefeated team in the state. So you got to feel real good about that team. But like you said earlier, it was kind of, the foundations was laid a few years back. Here's, I think, going a remarkable thing for this team. Opposition averaged only 1 in 7,900 yards per play, which is utterly fantastic to have that kind of thing. And then our offense was pretty fantastic. And it would rush for 3,800 yards and pass for 908, and that gives you 4793 total offense, and that means we averaged 342 yards per game. So that was exceptionally good. We intercepted 18 passes, the opposition intercepted 6, so there was that good ratio. We recovered 25 fumbles, and they recovered 32 fumbles, and they recovered 25. So there's a big margin in that. So that's what made the defense look doggone good, I think, is the fact that we were able to do that. When you look at the scoring, there's a lot of people scored in some capacity, and Frankie Walker led the run with 96 points, and Terry Mays 78, and James Walton 74. Doug Vaughn 54, and it was, everybody's contributed rather heavily to it. You look at the rushing end of the thing, we did have our 1,000-yard rusher, Larry Mays, our fullback, and this is pretty remarkable. He was our fullback, really our short yardage man, but he averaged 7 yards per carry, which is unusually good, scored 78 points. Frankie Walker was a great running quarterback, 894 yards total offense, and total rushing yards as a quarterback. That's extremely good. And he averaged 4.9 per carry. James Walton contributed 713, and Howard Casey contributed 650. Filson 165. But there again, a lot of people making contributions to the winning effort. Frankie upgraded our passing just a little bit. He completed 41% of his passes, and a good backup man began to emerge, and Terry Cox played some defense on that team, a great deal on defense, but he didn't play much offense at that time. But he attempted 4 passes that year and completed 3, so you begin to see a good quarterback emerging.
Right.
Pass receiving, Mark Lanford was our big receiver with 18 receptions. Doug Vaughn had 12, and Jake Kennedy had 11. If I'm not mistaken, Doug passed away, got killed, didn't he?
I think he did.
He got killed in an automobile wreck, I believe it was. So I was pretty sure that was the case, but I'd forgotten about it momentarily. Punt returns, had 2 returned for touchdowns. Little George Johnson returned 2 for touchdowns. Kickoff returns, punt returns, and kickoff returns, we had 2 returns. Stan Watson returned 2, so we got some yardage, we got some stuff out of that. And the punting, we didn't have to punt too terribly much. We didn't do a great job punting, but we didn't have to punt as many times. And averaged 28 yards, Mark Lanford did, and Tommy Burgess averaged 30. Kickoffs were a little bit better, began to kick the ball a little bit deeper, and that aspect of the game was a little bit better. But it was a great team effort again, with 2 or 3 people emerging as outstanding folks. But I think that playoffs, I know that Jim Pinkerton, who was executive secretary, had never seen us play, and he saw this game, and he made a comment to me after. He says, I thought y'all were overrated. He says, I didn't think you were that good. But he says, I saw some of the best 3A teams, I saw some of the best 4A teams in the state, and he says, I just thought it was a fluke. But he says, y'all are as good as any team I saw in the state all year long. He says, you ought to be number 1. And we were not ranked number 1 that year because we had the tie, and I think somebody else finished undefeated. I don't remember sure who it was. It was another classification, of course. But he made that observation. It was very complimentary at this ball, because he said, you just keep running backs in there. We were playing a lot of different backs, and it seemed like that everybody just did a good job. And there again, I think this is a classic example of a real team effort, a tremendous team effort.
Right. I remember some of those games, and that Burns game particularly sticks out in my mind because of the crowd that was there at that game, and it was played at Burns, I remember. Yeah. And that was the first football game that I ever took Rex, my son, to see. He was 2 years old at that particular time, and first game he ever saw. I'm sure he doesn't remember it, but I do because of the excitement. And I kept thinking years later I'd remember that game, and I would think, you know, it might not be a bad idea to have some games end in ties in situations like that. I'm not sure that rule is very good in every instance, having to play off every tie.
It depends on, you know, the caliber of team you're playing, but a tie can be just as important as a doggone win many times.
I know you want to mention the coaching staff this time.
Yeah, I think it would be, because we did have some changes. Larry Minish was still with us as defensive backfield coach, and Shell Dooley was still line coach. At this particular time, we went to one line coach, offensive and defensive line coach, and Shell performed that. He had assistant Jerry Houston, who had been over at Easley with Bill Carr, and he was with us 1 year as an assistant line coach. Steve Candler came to us that year as B-team coach and scout, and this was his first year with us. And, of course, Tommy Jennings was the B-team with us, the B-team, and Ben Dorman and Lewis Roper was with the B-team. So we had a little bit of change in the coaching staff, and certainly old Steve Candler, who made a lot of friends here at Woodruff, and I see him. He's in our conference now, and he's athletic director over at Woodmont. He left and went back home to Woodmont. And Steve was well liked by a lot of people, had an outstanding basketball team. He was coach here as basketball coach too, but I think an awful lot of Steve and all those guys.
Right. Well, that was an excellent. I know a lot of those people because I worked with them later on, and they were still around, and good friends of mine as well. But I guess statistic-wise, that year '76 might have been as big a gap as there ever was between our statistics and the opponent's statistics that time.
Well, I mean, the points alone reflect
Right.
that. When you score 512 points and opposition scores only 40, and you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 shutouts, you got to feel pretty good. And we hated to give up. We'd love to have had all shutouts, but sometimes you have flukes to give them touchdowns, but there was no flukes involved this. There wasn't like the situation we mentioned the other day when the third-team quarterback fumbled and they let Lawrence score on us. I think the score was something like 70-7.
Right.
But they were real upset about it because they scored. But this was a great team effort, and as I said, it'd be hard to figure, but it has to be as one of the top 5 teams of all times. Because their stats prove it, and the participation of the people that was involved. A lot of folks was involved, and it was just a really great year. And coming behind another state championship,
Right.
building 2 together, and you know, we go back to '56 and '57, there was 2 together, and in '65 we won in '65, and we played in '64 but got beat in '64. So we hadn't been able to win 2 back-to-back since '56 and '57.
Right.
And I think expectations become very high. Everybody expected to do it again next year, which we were able to do.
Right.
But that become the expectation. I think of the story that the old guy told me, that the guy that came to do renovation, when he says, "You've played heck, you've won a state championship, and now nothing will satisfy these folks but state championships." Right. And I think that's true in anything. Once you reach a certain level of competition or a certain level of achievement, you expect to do that over again. You think about a high jumper. He may struggle to get 6 feet. But finally, when he gets 6 feet, nothing else is any good anymore. He's expected to go over 6 feet. And that's the new measuring thing for him. He's got to get 6 feet or better. And sometimes that may be his limit. He may not be able to do much better, but everybody expects him to do better. And you kind of improve in athletics on plateaus anyhow, as an individual and as a team, and I think this certainly put us on a plateau that we were able to keep moving ahead of some opposition.
Well, one thing, Coach, you beat your yearly average that year. The average defense would give them about 3 points a game that particular year because of all those shutouts, and so the 1976 is certainly one of the best years, and I saw a lot of those games, and I think Mr. Pickerton was certainly right in his assessment there. But now, and I think the key thing that is something you can't find in the papers there is the spirit and the atmosphere and so forth. Because I came about 3 years later, and that was still there, and it's extended on for several years after that. And it seems like there was a commitment from the whole town and community.
Oh yes, we've had more people at individual games since that time, but this was constant. We'd go away to play, and we'd go to, say, play Blue Ridge at Blue Ridge, and we'd get there 2 hours ahead of game time, and our stands would be full. I mean, people, they were tailgating, they were going, they were totally involved and totally excited about the whole situation. And when we go to play at Lakeview, we get down there, people all over the place, and we're playing not at Lakeview, but at Dillon. And I think this is the beginning of that era where they felt like this is the greatest football team and the greatest program in the whole doggone state. And they really, and some of those people still support us too. I mean, that's the thing about it. But some of them, as they've got older, we've lost a lot of them, passed on that were Rapid supporters. I know I can think of a dozen different people that had reserved seats that didn't miss a game until the year they suddenly become ill and they pass away in another year. We lose a lot of those folks, but I think that the general interest of downtown merchants was totally involved. Everybody was involved. It was a promotion on every ball game. It was a happening, and I think you're exactly right. The fans helped win a lot of those ball games.
Historians will tell you that sometimes events take on a momentum of their own. They just seem to start